By the time they realized the stewardess wasn't supposed to be removed from the room, it was already too late. The emergency board session had been running for 4 hours. Terminal D of the Hale Aerolith Dominion headquarters building, the floor that housed the Neural Logistics Command Center, had been placed under a Level 3 access lockdown at the instruction of CFO Sarah Fix-Dorn, who had cited infrastructure stability protocols as justification. 22 board members, 3 institutional representatives, and a room full of lawyers were watching the live feed of the company's primary routing intelligence deteriorate in real time. Carrier sync rates were declining. Load distribution models were throwing cascading variance errors. The system that managed $41 billion of annual freight movement was behaving as if something essential had been subtracted from it. Nobody in that room could explain it. Except that one of them, if they had looked carefully, might have noticed the moment it had started. It started when security escorted me out of the building. Let me take you back to the beginning. Or at least to the beginning I understood at the time. My name is Ilyrra Vance. For 9 years I worked as a cabin operations lead for Hale Aerolith Dominion's executive fleet division. Effectively a senior stewardess on the private aircraft that moved the company's most important clients and personnel around the world. I was not, by any visible measure, a significant person at Hale Aerolith. I had no equity, no title above operations lead, no office, and no particular champion within the executive hierarchy beyond the founder himself, who had hired me personally 8 years before his death and who had asked, in a way that I found unusual at the time, that I be kept on the executive fleet rotation regardless of what else changed. I also have a scar that runs from my left temple to the corner of my jaw. I was 26 when I got it. I don't remember how. That has always struck me as strange, but I have had enough years to stop pressing at the absence of memory the way you press at a bruise. Some things don't come back. You learn to organize your life around the gap. What I remember is waking up in a hospital room. A man I didn't recognize sitting in the corner. He said his name was Cadman Hale and that I had been in an accident and that I was going to be all right. He said he was sorry. He said it with the kind of precision that suggested he had chosen the exact weight of those 3 words very carefully. I didn't understand then what he was sorry for. I am getting ahead of myself. The empire Cadman built from nothing in the early 2000s was, by the time of his death 17 months ago, one of the 10 largest aviation logistics platforms in the world. Hale Aerolith Dominion moved cargo, data, and people with an efficiency that its competitors studied and could not replicate. The reason they could not replicate it, though they had tried, had reverse-engineered its public-facing systems and hired away its logistics engineers and produced nothing that came close, was a proprietary neural routing intelligence called the Ether framework. Ether did not function like conventional optimization software. It did not process. It predicted. It ran pattern recognition on atmospheric data, carrier behavior, geopolitical disruption signals, and freight demand shifts simultaneously, and it arrived at routing solutions that human analysts would have needed 3 days and a large team to produce. It did it in under 4 seconds. The engineers who had built it gave a consistent answer when asked about its architecture. It had been trained on a novel cognitive pattern that produced prediction structures no conventional model could generate. Where that pattern had come from, they would not say. The company had guarded that question with unusual care for 2 decades. I knew none of this when I was working the executive fleet. I served coffee and managed cabin logistics and made sure the right passengers got the right documents at the right moment. I was good at the work. I was also, if I am being accurate, good at things I had no formal training in. I could tell when a flight path had been flagged before the notification appeared on the system display. I would find myself writing down routing alternatives before the navigation team had communicated any problem. Once, on a transatlantic crossing, I told the senior pilot we needed to climb 2,000 feet and shift 11 degrees north before any instrument had registered the pressure system building ahead of us. He looked at me the way people often looked at me, somewhere between dismissal and unease. He made the adjustment. The system flag appeared 40 seconds later. I told myself it was pattern recognition. A kind of learned environmental awareness from years of airborne work. I believed that. It was easier than the alternative. Cadman Hale died 14 months before the emergency board session. He went quickly, which is the merciful way. He had time to arrange his affairs but not, as it turned out, enough time to arrange the one thing that might have prevented what followed, a succession transition that his son could survive. Vorian Hale was 34 years old when he inherited the chairman and CEO titles. He was technically capable. He had an MBA from a school that impressed people who were impressed by such things, and a decade of experience in the company's commercial aviation division. He understood the revenue architecture of Hale Aerolith at the surface level, the routes, the contracts, the client relationships. What he did not understand was the depth of the infrastructure beneath it. He had not needed to, because his father had always been the person who understood the depth. He also had his father's face without his father's patience. The resemblance was close enough to be cruel. Every time I served him in the executive cabin, which I did perhaps 40 times in the first year of his leadership, I would catch myself watching for some echo of the older man, some moment of stillness behind the eyes, some pause before speaking. It was never there. On my 41st service rotation with Vorian Hale, he told me to find another aircraft. He didn't say it directly. He said it the way that men in his position say things, through an intermediary, with the intermediary present so the words could be delivered without eye contact. His executive assistant, a young man named Dren who always seemed vaguely embarrassed by his own job, handed me a transfer memo at the gate of Vorian's departure hangar and said, with genuine discomfort, that the principal had requested a different cabin assignments profile for the executive fleet going forward. I read the memo standing on the tarmac in the cold. The transfer was to regional cargo monitoring. Ground role. Administrative. There were perhaps a dozen people nearby. Crew, ground staff, a contract logistics coordinator whose name I didn't know. I was aware of the scar on my face in the particular way you become aware of it when you suspect it's being looked at. Thank you, I told Dren. He nodded and walked back toward the aircraft. I folded the memo and put it in my jacket pocket and went to find my new assignment. The regional cargo monitoring position was in a sub-level of Terminal D that most of the company's headquarters staff didn't know existed. It housed legacy systems, older routing infrastructure that had been superseded by Ether but was maintained as a regulatory redundancy backup. The room had 17 terminals, 11 of which were operational. There were 2 other people assigned there. A data archivist named Saul who had worked at Hale Aerolith for 22 years and who spoke very little, and a systems maintenance technician named Petra who came in 3 days a week and always brought her own coffee. I was given a desk and a monitor and told that my primary responsibility was watching error logs from the legacy routing backup for anything that required escalation. For 6 days I did exactly that. I watched logs. I read error reports. I filed 3 minor escalation tickets. On the 7th day, something happened that I could not explain then and cannot fully explain now. I was sitting at my terminal at approximately 11 in the evening. I had stayed late to complete a backlog of archive reconciliation, and the screen in front of me shifted. Not visually. Not in any way that would have registered on a camera or a log entry. The display was showing the same regional cargo routing status it had been showing all evening. But something in the data configuration had changed in my perception of it. The numbers resolved into a pattern I didn't have a name for, and inside that pattern I could see, there is no better word, a structural imbalance in Ether's live distribution load that was 3 routing cycles away from producing a carrier sync failure on the southeastern freight corridor. I stared at the screen for approximately 40 seconds. Then I pulled up the Ether monitoring interface. I had read-only access as a legacy systems operator, and ran a manual query on the southeastern corridor load distribution. The query returned normal values. Nothing flagged. Nothing within variance thresholds. I ran it again and requested the raw confidence interval data underneath the normalized output. The confidence intervals were narrowing. Almost imperceptibly, but narrowing. The kind of thing that would not trigger an automated alert for another 3 routing cycles but that, if you could see the direction of the trajectory rather than just the current value, looked like the early architecture of a significant failure. I wrote up an observation memo and sent it through the legacy systems escalation channel, which I later found out was monitored by exactly one junior analyst who worked the overnight shift in ether operations. His name was Hale. He told me later that he almost dismissed it. He didn't dismiss it because the failure I had described occurred, on schedule, 2 routing cycles later. The carrier sync failure affected 11 freight corridors for approximately 4 hours before Ether's self-correction protocols resolved it. Nobody at the executive level connected the advance warning to me. Why would they? I was in the basement watching legacy logs. I was the stewardess who had been moved off the executive fleet. I was the woman with the scar who served coffee and was otherwise invisible. I went back to watching my screens. 2 weeks after the corridor event, Hale appeared at the entrance to my sublevel. He was young, maybe 28, with the particular look of someone who has been carrying a question for longer than is comfortable. He sat down across from me without being invited. "How did you know?" he asked. "I saw a pattern," I said. "In the legacy display." "Yes." He looked at the screen in front of me for a moment. The legacy display doesn't have access to Ether's confidence interval infrastructure. It only shows the normalized output layer. I said nothing to that. He left without explaining why he had come, and for 2 weeks I heard nothing further. Then Hale returned and told me, with the careful tone of someone delivering information they don't fully understand, that someone in Ether's architecture division wanted to meet with me. The meeting never happened. Before it could be scheduled, Vorian Hale made his most consequential mistake. It was a Tuesday, 17 days after the corridor event, and Vorian had called an all-hands address in the main atrium of headquarters to announce what he was describing as the company's new strategic direction. He had spent 4 months preparing the announcement, which positioned Hale Aerolith for an aggressive expansion into autonomous ground logistics. A pivot that would require significant capital and that the company's existing debt structure was not, in the opinion of several people who understood the company's finances more carefully than Vorian did, able to support. I was there because all staff had been required to attend. I stood near the back of the atrium with Saul and Petra and approximately 300 other employees. Vorian spoke from a raised platform at the front. He was polished. He was composed. He delivered the announcement with the practiced confidence of someone who has rehearsed a performance so many times it has begun to feel like conviction. He also, near the end of his address, made a point of describing the company's coming cultural transformation. The new Hale Aerolith would be leaner, more dynamic, more selective in its personnel architecture. He used the phrase, elevating the talent profile, without apparently hearing how it sounded to the people who worked in the sublevels and the cargo bays and the overnight data rooms. Then, as he was leaving the platform, someone near the front of the atrium said something I didn't hear. Vorian paused. He smiled. He said, loudly enough to carry, "I think we can all agree that the stewardess assignment rotation was probably not optimized for results." There was laughter. Not everyone laughed. But enough people did that the sound had weight. I did not react. I looked at the back of the chair in front of me. I noted the time on my phone, 10:47 a.m. I thought about the confidence intervals I had been watching all week, which were doing something I had not yet written up because I wasn't sure how to describe it. They were describing a company being prepared for dismemberment from the inside. I had not understood, until I began spending 10 hours a day watching financial data patterns through the particular lens the legacy terminals gave me, how much of what I perceived translated into financial signal. I noticed things I had no right to notice. I noticed, 3 weeks before it became visible in any external report, that the risk modeling in Hale Aerolith's senior debt covenants had been reconfigured in a way that would accelerate liquidity covenant triggers under specific market conditions. Someone had moved the goalposts while the game was running. The someone, I came to understand gradually and then all at once, was Seraphics Dorn. Dorn had been CFO for 6 years. She was, by every conventional metric, formidably capable. She had restructured the company's debt profile twice, managed 2 major acquisition integrations, and maintained the investor relationships that kept Hale Aerolith's credit rating above the threshold that its operational contracts required. She was also, I now understood, systematically restructuring those same credit instruments in a way that would make them catastrophically vulnerable to a coordinated external liquidity event. Paired with an institutional investor named Ilyrra Vance, who had been quietly accumulating a secondary debt position in Hale Aerolith's unsecured credit facility for 8 months, the arrangement was becoming clear to me in the way that structural failures always become clear in data, not through any single flag, but through the shape of multiple small movements converging toward the same point. They were engineering a controlled collapse. Dorn from the inside. Vire from outside. When the liquidity covenants tripped, which they would, given sufficient market pressure, given the specific modifications Dorn had introduced into the risk model tolerances, Vire's debt position would give him the asset seizure rights that a straight acquisition attempt would never have produced. Vori and Hale, who trusted Dorn completely and had never met Ilyrra Vance in person, was the final component. The distracted, ambitious, insufficiently attentive heir who would not see any of it coming until his company was already legally undefendable. I had been watching this assemble for 6 weeks when the emergency board session was called. The immediate catalyst was not the liquidity position. It was ether. 3 days before the board session, the neural routing system began degrading. Not in the way systems degrade from overload or underfunding, not from strain. From something more specific. The variance errors started in the secondary routing architecture and migrated toward the primary distribution logic in a pattern that the ether engineering team had never encountered. They ran diagnostics. They patched. The degradation continued. By the time the board was convened, the system that managed $41 billion of annual freight movement was operating at 63% of nominal efficiency and declining by approximately 1.2% per hour. No one could explain it. I could see the shape of it, though I could not have explained what I was seeing. It was like watching a language begin to lose vocabulary. The system was not failing. It was becoming less fluent. Less itself. As if something it had been oriented toward was no longer present. The board session was convened at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday. I knew about it because Hale had been trying to reach me for 18 hours. He left 3 messages. The last one said, simply, "They need to know about the legacy access patterns. I think you need to be in this room." I arrived at Terminal D at 5:40. I was stopped at the security checkpoint by 2 officers who informed me that Level 3 access restrictions were in effect and that my clearance did not permit entry to the board floor. I said I had been requested by the Ether operations team. They said my name was not on the approved access list. Dorn had issued the access list. I stood at the checkpoint for a moment. Behind me, through the terminal's glass wall, the pre-dawn sky over the airfield was the particular blue that exists for about 12 minutes before it becomes morning. I looked at the sky. I thought about a dream I had been having for several months, always the same image, a room full of light and an enormous noise and a warmth I could not describe as heat but that I understood, on waking, to have been structural. To have been something entering me rather than something burning away. "I'll wait," I told the security officers. I sat in the corridor outside the checkpoint for 38 minutes. Then the door behind the checkpoint opened and a woman I had never met walked through it and looked at me with an expression I could not read. Her name, she told me, was Dr. Senia Rad. She had been Cadman Hale's lead cognitive systems architect for 11 years. She was the person who had built Ether. And she had been, she said, monitoring the access logs of the legacy terminals in the sublevel for the past 3 weeks. My query patterns. My escalation memos. The specific routing intervals I had been watching and the frequency with which my observations preceded system events by cycles that conventional analysis would not have anticipated. She looked at my face when she said that. At the scar. Not with pity, which was the most common response, and not with the careful non-looking of people who have practiced not reacting. With recognition. "We need to have a conversation," she said. "But first, we need you in that room." She walked me through the checkpoint and into the elevator. The full board was assembled on the other side of the glass. 22 members, lawyers, institutional representatives, Vorian at the head of the table with the controlled expression of a man who is afraid but cannot afford to show it. Seraphic Dorn sat to his left with the composed stillness of someone who knows where all the exits are. Dr. Rad walked me to a terminal at the side of the room. The ether monitoring interface was open on the display. The system status indicators were a landscape of amber and red. "Can you tell me what you see?" she said quietly. I looked at the display. I sat down. I did not intend to sit. It happened in the way that certain actions happen when your body understands something your mind is still catching up to. I placed both hands on the desk surface, not on the keyboard, and looked at the data. Vorian said something from the head of the table. His voice had an edge I had not heard before, not authority, but its inverse. Something close to desperation wearing authority as a coat. He said my name with the particular intonation of a man who cannot understand why the woman he demoted off his aircraft is now sitting at a terminal in the most critical infrastructure session his company has ever convened. I did not look up. The data was telling me something I did not yet have words for. Inside it was the shape of the degradation. And inside the degradation was, unmistakably, a structural signature I recognized the way you recognize a word in your native language even when you haven't heard it in decades. It was a pattern I knew. Not intellectually. In some way that was older than intellect, deeper than memory, embedded in whatever architecture of perception had been built into me before I was old enough to consent to it. Which is the part one need to tell you now. Because you have been patient, and the explanation is owed. Cadman Hale began development of the Ether framework in the late 1990s. The project's central challenge was not computational power but cognitive architecture. The pattern structures required to predict complex, multivariable disruption events in aviation logistic systems could not, at that time, be generated by any synthetic model that the engineering team could produce. The patterns were real. They occurred in human cognition, specifically in the brains of a small subset of individuals who demonstrated unusual predictive accuracy in high-stakes environmental contexts. Pilots. Air traffic controllers. A specific profile of operational analyst. The engineering team had studied these individuals for several years, attempting to extract and codify the pattern architecture that produced their predictive ability. They had found nothing that could be formalized. The patterns were too organic. Too personal. Then a team member proposed something that Cadman had initially rejected and ultimately, under the pressure of a funding timeline, approved: direct cognitive mapping from a living subject whose predictive architecture matched the requirements. The subject needed to be young enough for the mapping process to work cleanly. She needed to demonstrate the right pattern profile. She needed to be, in the team's careful clinical language, in a condition of neurological openness, which is to say, the process could not be done ethically without a set of circumstances that no ethical review board would have approved under normal conditions. The circumstances were provided by an accident. A research aircraft. A fuel systems test. An explosion that nobody was supposed to be near. A young woman who had wandered into the perimeter. A child, technically, 17 years old, the daughter of one of the facility's technical staff, who was found in the wreckage with burns severe enough to scar, and a neurological state that the team's cognitive architect described, in documentation I have since read, as exhibiting extraordinary natural pattern coherence. Cadman Hale made a decision. He told himself it was medical intervention. That the mapping process would be done alongside treatment, that the girl would be cared for, that she would never know, that the memory suppression was a mercy, that she would be better without the fragments of a traumatic event, better without the part of the experience that involved a team of engineers attaching monitoring equipment to her unconscious brain for 47 hours while they extracted the cognitive architecture that would become the origin pattern for Ether. He was wrong about most of that. He spent 17 years knowing he was wrong. He hired me, 8 years after the event, because he needed to be able to look at what he had done and not look away from it. He was not a man who looked away from things. It was both his most significant quality and, in this case, grotesquely insufficient as a form of accountability. He never told me. I have thought about why. I do not have a clean answer. What I know is that Ether was not trained on my cognitive pattern. It was built from it. The system's predictive architecture was not inspired by the way I processed environmental data, it was structured around the specific neural pathways that generated my perception. The engineers had called it cognitive imprinting. The system did not model my mind. It extended it. Which is why, for 2 decades, it had been operating as a highly capable and inexplicably intuitive logistics intelligence. And which is why, when I was removed from the building 3 days earlier, it had begun to lose fluency. I did not understand any of this when I sat down at that terminal in the emergency board session. Dr. Rad had not yet told me the full history. She had told me enough, that my access patterns in the legacy system had been triggering sympathetic responses in Ether's secondary routing layer. That something in my presence in the building, my proximity to the infrastructure, had been providing a calibration signal the system had been receiving and relying on without anyone fully understanding that was what was happening. That when I was walked out by security, the system had begun, gradually, measurably, and now critically, drifting from its operational baseline. What I understood, sitting at that terminal, was the shape of the problem. What I did not yet understand was the shape of myself. I began with the financial architecture, because it was the most urgent. Dorn's risk model manipulation was not visible in the Ether interface directly, but I could see the load distribution consequences of the liquidity covenant configuration she had created. The way certain freight corridors had been deprioritized in a pattern consistent with preparing specific asset classes for transfer rather than optimizing for operational efficiency. The signature of planned divestiture, hidden inside operational routing choices. I identified 4 specific corridor modifications and traced them backward through the routing log to the parameter adjustments that had produced them, which in turn mapped to covenant trigger thresholds that matched Kaylee's Vire's secondary debt position with a precision that was not accidental. I did not speak. I compiled the sequence in the legacy documentation interface and submitted it through the escalation channel to the board's legal team representative, who received it, read the first 2 pages, and asked Dr. Rad in a lowered voice whether the analysis was reliable. Dr. Rad said, "In my experience, yes." While the legal team was reviewing the financial analysis, I moved to the Ether stability problem, which required something different. Not analysis. Not query. Something I could not have explained to anyone in that room without sounding like I was describing something that couldn't be real. I placed my hands on the terminal's edge, not the keyboard, the housing itself, the metal frame, and I looked at the live routing display. I looked at it the way I had been looking at data displays for 9 years without knowing what I was doing. The way I had been looking at weather patterns and cargo loads and carrier behavior without knowing that what I was actually doing was making contact with something that had been built from the architecture of my own perception. The system did not respond to my commands. There were no commands. It responded to something more fundamental than that. The variance errors began narrowing. Not instantly. Not dramatically. The way a signal stabilizes when interference is removed. A slow resolution toward clarity. The amber indicators shifted. The primary distribution logic reoriented. The carrier sync rates began recovering. The room noticed. The board members who had been watching the status indicators for 4 hours watched them move in the wrong direction, from the perspective of everything they expected, toward green. No one spoke for a considerable moment. Then Thomas Aldrich, the longest-serving board member, who had known Cadman Hale since the company's founding year, looked at Dr. Rad and said, very quietly, "How long has she been here?" 9 years, Dr. Rad said. And before that? 17 years before that, Dr. Rad said. She just didn't know it. What happened next was, by necessity, slow. The legal mechanisms that Dorn had constructed were not reversible by a gesture. They required documentation, formal governance action, regulatory notification. The board voted within that session to place the liquidity covenant renegotiation on emergency governance review, which suspended Vire's asset seizure rights for a period that would allow independent legal assessment. Dorn's parameter modifications were flagged in the board record and referred to the audit committee along with a formal conflict of interest disclosure. Dorn said nothing during any of this. She sat at the table with her hands folded and her expression entirely composed. She was, I recognized, a person who had known from the beginning that there might come a moment when the structure she had built was examined too closely, and had decided in advance not to produce a scene when that moment arrived. There is a discipline to that. I found it, briefly, easier to respect than the alternatives. Vorian Hale did not compose himself as well. He said my name twice more during the session, each time with a different quality. The first time with something that wanted to be authority and wasn't. The second time with something more honest, that I did not try to name. I did not look at him when he spoke. I was watching the routing display and waiting for it to tell me something was stable. It did, eventually. 3 hours and 17 minutes after I sat down, Ether's operational efficiency metrics returned to nominal. The system resumed its full predictive function. $41 billion of annual freight movement resumed flowing through the world's infrastructure without most of the people responsible for it knowing how close it had come to stopping entirely, or why it had recovered. The emergency session adjourned at 2 in the afternoon. I sat in the corridor afterward for a while. The atrium below was quiet. The pre-morning blue had long since become ordinary afternoon light. Hale came and sat beside me without saying anything, which I appreciated. Eventually Dr. Rad came too and handed me a sealed folder and said there was a great deal she needed to explain and that I had the right to understand all of it and also the right to take as much time as I needed before I chose whether I wanted to. I held the folder in both hands. I thought about Cadman Hale, dying with the knowledge of what he had done and the inadequacy of having built a career out of it. I thought about the 17 years I had spent not knowing what I carried. I thought about the scar on my face and the gap in my memory and the dreams of warmth that was not heat, and the way my hands knew things before my mind had names for them. I thought about all the times I had predicted turbulence before the instruments registered it, and all the times I had written down routing alternatives before anyone asked, and all the times I had felt, near the terminals, a low persistent pressure like the edge of a frequency I was almost but not quite pitched to hear. And I thought about how I had explained all of it to myself, over 9 years, as something learned. Pattern recognition. Environmental familiarity. The ordinary accumulated intelligence of a person who paid attention. I opened the folder. There is more to tell. The audit, the governance restructuring, the formal legal separation of Dorn from her CFO role, the eventual quiet departure of Vire from his debt position once the legal exposure of the scheme became apparent to his own counsel. The board's long, uncomfortable, ongoing reckoning with the documentation Dr. Rad possessed about the company's origin. The question of what compensation looks like when what was taken cannot be returned. These things have their own arcs and their own timelines, and most of them are still in motion. What I want to tell you is the smaller thing. The thing that is harder to make into a clean narrative. I went back to Terminal D the following week. Not to the sub-level, the legacy terminals, SOL, the overnight error logs. To the Ether operations floor, where Dr. Rad had arranged access for me and where I sat, for the first time, at a primary interface with no read-only restriction and no clearance limitation. I sat there and I looked at the full live architecture of the system, everything visible at once, and I understood something I had been trying to find language for since. It was not that I was powerful. It was not that I had been wronged and was now being acknowledged. It was not even that the man who had made a decision about my unconscious body when I was 17 years old had built the largest logistics intelligence in the world around the consequence of that decision, and that the consequence was me. What I understood was simpler. I had thought, for 9 years and more, that I survived the fire. I had thought survival was the thing. I had organized my life around it. The gap in my memory. The scar. The strange peripheral vision for patterns. The way I moved through the world slightly sideways from everyone else, watching, quiet, understanding things I had no formal right to understand and saying nothing about them because I had no framework for what I was seeing. I had thought I survived the fire. But the fire had not left me behind. The fire had built something, and the thing it built had gone on without me for 17 years, and when I walked back into proximity with it, it had known me in the way that systems know their origin, not with language, not with memory, but with a structural recognition deeper than either. I did not survive the fire. The fire built the empire around me. And what I still cannot answer, what no one has answered, not Dr. Rad, not the lawyers, not the audit documents or the governance reports or any of the careful institutional language that has been applied to the history of what was done, is whether the girl who wandered into the perimeter of a fuel systems test on a Tuesday afternoon in the late 90s would have chosen this, if anyone had thought to ask her. I find I can sit with that question now. I could not, for a long time. But I notice that the answer has not stopped mattering simply because no one will ever know it. That seems like something worth remembering.